Space waves all over in space, which is the light bouncing around the room, going from one thing to the other, and it's all really there, really, really there. But you gotta stop and think about it, about the complexity, to really get the pleasure. It's all really there, really, really there. The inconceivable nature, nature. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space. There's billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of sparks. The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way that
Hello, my name is Ella Burrows, your student co-chair of EduCon, and I would like to personally welcome you to EduCon 2.9. I'm sure you're all just excited as we are for the endless conversations, discoveries, and new bonds that will be made while we appreciate and build stronger education systems in our communities. My time here at SLA has been nothing but a learning experience, and it is difficult for me to even begin to tell you what it has done for me. But over the next few days, we can share that with you, and you can share what your amazing schools do too. Here at SLA, we are taught to make mistakes and learn from them, and then take full control of our learning career. We as students are in charge of making amazing things happen, and you'll find that being a small school never stops us from doing big things. We use our core values to push and learn and create, and being a project-based school puts us in real-world situations where we are solving real issues amongst learning how to work with our peers. We learn how to present our knowledge and show off what we know about what we have done, which makes us stronger. It is crucial for us to feel empowered by what we have created and learned, and project-based learning does just that. I have learned more than I could have ever imagined in the past 3 years. Walking through these doors, I would have never believed that I would have won first place in the Philadelphia Debate League, or that I would be running 3 days a week training with such amazing teachers for the Broad Street Run, creating up to 16 major projects a year, or that I'd even discover that I wanted to be an educator too one day. Over the past few years, I've learned that my passion is education, and without SLA, I would have never been able to see how beautiful and life-changing a quality education can be for a student. This school has opened my eyes to a world I'm truly in love with, and I'm sure you can all relate as well. My school is my home, and where my teachers who I can trust, and support and challenge me to be my best, and where I'm one of yet many in a big happy family who are brilliant in their own ways. It's not every day you get to be a part of such a wonderful community, which you can tell by the fact that you have to force us to leave school sometimes. This school has allowed myself and many others to grow as individuals. I'm truly grateful to be a part of such an amazing school. I look forward to the upcoming weekend, and I hope you all leave with a little bit of what I see every day, and the new innovative ideas to continue to create such wonderful schools. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for joining us for EduCon 2.9. And now, to moderate tonight's panel, I am honored and excited to introduce the Franklin Institute's Chief Bioscientist, Dr. Jayatri Das.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Franklin Institute. It is a true honor for me to be asked to moderate this discussion tonight. And the mission of the Franklin Institute is to inspire a passion for learning about science and technology. And that's something that we've shared from the very beginning with the Science Leadership Academy. And now to welcome all of you here into the Franklin Institute to really share and build on that mission is so important to what we do every day. The conversations that you'll have this weekend and the ideas that you'll generate, I think, are more timely now than ever, even though EduCon's been going on for 10 years, which is amazing. But you all know that we're living in a world right now where there's this thing called alternative facts, and it's more critical than ever that we think about how we teach students to observe, collect evidence, and integrate that knowledge into an understanding of how the world works, and not just spin it into how it fits their preconceived opinions. So this is a great opportunity for us to think about, thank you. It's a great opportunity for us to think about the practices that underlie our work, the tools that we have to make it better, and the support that we can give each other as a community of educators to make sure that we can rise up and meet this challenge. So that's what lies ahead of us, and it's great to see so many faces who are ready to tackle that head on. To kickstart that conversation, however, we're delighted to have our 3 panelists here tonight. First, we'll be speaking with Christine Knapp from the Office of Sustainability in the City of Philadelphia. Next, we'll be talking to Michelle Johnson from the University of Pennsylvania. And finally, we'll end with Kevin, and I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your last name. Werbach. I didn't know whether Werbach or Anyway, I meant to ask you, but thank you. Kevin Werbach, also from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So the format of tonight's discussion will lead off some individual conversations with each of them to find a little bit more about their backgrounds and thinking about how they got to where they are in a time where their fields have changed from where they started. And then we'll bring everybody together to really tackle some of these ideas about innovation and sustainability. So first, Christine, you want to come on up? So I wanted to start with you because I think when most of us outside of the field of education, out in society, think about the buzzword of sustainability, environmental sustainability is some of the obvious things that come to mind. And throughout your career, you've worked on air, you've worked on water, recycling, energy, all of these things that people associate with this concept of preserving the earth. And yet, when this awareness of what sustainability means is something that has built up over the years. It's certainly not something that I knew about when I was in school. So what originated your interest in sustainability?
Well, I will say the word sustainability, is this working? Yeah, okay. The word sustainability also really didn't exist when I got started in the field. I graduated from college in 2001, and we still sort of generally referred to the movement as the environmental movement. What first really got me interested, I had been sort of a political government junkie from a really early age. I knew in like elementary school that I wanted to work in government. So there was a variety of political issues that I was interested in. When I graduated, I ended up kind of accidentally falling into an environmental organization, primarily because I didn't know anyone in Philadelphia and I couldn't work for free. And it's hard to break into politics if you don't know someone or are willing to work for free. So an environmental organization gave me an opportunity to knock on doors and do some community organizing. And I did that work in Southwest Philadelphia around what was then the Sunoco refinery. And having the chance to meet people in the community that were really impacted personally by the pollution that was coming from the refinery, people who suffered from asthma and other health problems, even sort of even if there wasn't physical health problems, I think some folks had mental health issues with the perception of being sort of always in the shadow of this hulking refinery. It really, from that point, I was hooked. That I saw that this was not a movement just about rainforests and polar bears. This was a movement about real people in our own backyards, many of whom were disadvantaged in a variety of ways, not the least of which was economically. So the challenge was also that some people in the neighborhood were employed in the refinery, and so you don't want to just shut it down. You have to find a way to link economic and environmental justice together to create sort of a more just city where everyone thrives. So that for me was when I got hooked.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about whether you want to call it the environmental movement or sustainability is it really is a very integrative space where there's economics, there's health, and as you mentioned, mental health, I think is something that we're really starting to understand as part of the space. Mm-hmm. But also the challenge between old and new, and this is something that we were talking about a little bit before we came into the room here, that Philadelphia is one of the oldest cities in America, and that poses both challenges and benefits. Can you talk a little bit about how you've embraced that and how we can learn from the past while still looking forward into the future?
Sure. Yeah, I've heard. I'm a transplant to Philadelphia. I came to Villanova and stayed after graduation. So I grew up in New York, and I think sometimes outsiders look at Philadelphia in a different way than people who grew up here did. And to me, the term I would have always heard was that Philadelphia had good bones. That we were sort of built at a time when we kind of made our streets really walkable because we weren't using cars yet, and we had this tremendous park system that was initially intended to protect our rivers that were our sources of drinking water. And our iconic housing stock were these row homes where you have a home on either side, making them fairly energy efficient. So we had this sort of great structure for sustainability that we could kind of build on and grow from. And I think it's one of the reasons why cities in general are more sustainable on average than places that are more spread out, is because we have the structure in place where people can take transit and live in density and access green space. But there are also obviously problems that come along with it. I think our old sewer system is a great example of one of the problems that we're now facing as a city, that we built our city on a sewer system, assuming that we were going to be a pretty small-sized city, and now we're 1.5 million people, and that system's falling apart. So there are problems with it, but I think one of the things that we were talking about is I think it's always interesting to think about what's old is new again, and how sustainability actions are oftentimes just mimicking what nature would do, or what sort of we did many decades and generations ago. So that issue of an old sewer system, we're now addressing that problem by using green infrastructure, which is essentially tools like trees and parks that just allow more natural ways of managing water. I use the example of when talking about some cities have banned or taxed plastic bags, and people kind of lose their minds, like, what will we do without a plastic bag? And I'm always like, just ask your grandmother or your grandfather. They didn't have them when they were growing up, and somehow they shopped and got what they needed home, whether it was a canvas bag or a basket or other things. So, I mean, we can learn a lot from generations before us about conservation and ways to do things. We don't always necessarily need to like invent the new like drone that's going to carry your groceries home for you. Instead, just use a bag that isn't plastic. So I think there's a lot that we can learn meshing old and new approaches.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, again, was the structure of cities and the proximity of people to each other and to the natural resources around us. And I think in one way that's a benefit to one of the other challenges about talking about, whether it's climate change or sustainability, which is that oftentimes the impact of any individual action can only be seen at the collective level. How do you keep people motivated towards working on sustainability?
It is certainly difficult, and I think people sometimes do lose sight, the classic, like, going back to bags again, the classic, like, paper versus plastic decision, and people fret so much, and it's like, what, really, at the end of the day, who you vote for is going to be a lot more impactful than which bag you use. And so kind of keep our eye on some of the larger structures that make policies that drive behavior rather than just the individual. That being said, we can just go to a landfill and see what we're all producing and know that each individual one of us are contributing to that. So individual action is important. And I think the two ways that I think are most successful is, one, to speak to the co-benefits, right? People will do what is in their or their family's best interest in terms of health. People may not, it may be too hard to wrap your head around air pollution, but when your child has asthma, I think you really start to make those links and want to be involved in daily actions that you can take to improve air quality in your neighborhood, even if you're the only one doing it. Same thing for saving money. You might use an LED light bulb just to save a few bucks, even if you don't care how much carbon dioxide it's reducing in the atmosphere as well. So I think getting to people where they are and finding other benefits to the work is always successful. And the other thing is, I think, related to the conversation we'll be moving towards in terms of innovation. And I do see how technology in particular, but other innovations that help to make things either cheaper and or easier do drive behavior. I think we all know at certain times that we should be doing something that, like, we shouldn't be using water bottles, but look how convenient it is. We have a panel. Let's just grab some bottles and put them on there. We have to go find a.
No, she brought her own reusable water bottle. So
otherwise, you have to go find pitchers and find cups, and it's hard. So the easier you can make things for people, the quicker they're going to do it. And I'll talk about it, I'm sure, later as well, but I keep thinking about driverless cars and how, one of the things in the city we struggle with is trying to get people to move to low or no carbon forms of transportation, and how the Ubers and Lyfts are kind of allowing people to not have to own a car. I mean, they're still using that service that is a car. But imagine we get to a scenario where all of our cars are driverless and nobody has to own them, how much fewer there would be. And people wouldn't be doing it because it would be the environmentally right thing to do. They'd be doing it because it's so convenient, right? So I think that I'm interested in sort of figuring out ways to make it easier for people to take action.
I think that's a really important point. It's how do you frame each of these issues so that depending on who you are and what issues are important to you, it's relevant to you in a different way. And I think as educators, we're always looking for that connection to make things relevant for our students. So So thank you for sharing your perspective on that. We will come back to many of those ideas. But for now, I'd like to give Christine a hand and swap out for Michelle. Yeah. So Michelle, come on.
Hello.
So I have to say that when I started researching you and your work, I was totally psyched by the fact that the name of your lab is a rehabilitation robotics lab. Like, that just sounds so cool. So can you just start out telling us a little bit about the kind of projects that you work on, and thinking about, again, this transition from the old that's worked to the new, that's exciting, and finding the balance between the two. How does your work complement some of the existing therapies, and where are you really pushing new boundaries?
Good question. So just to give you a context, so my lab is, so I'm a faculty in physical medicine and rehab. So my lab focuses on rehabilitation medicine, but I'm also, my PhD is in mechanical engineering. So coming from the robotics angle, so where I've been trying to meld is rehabilitation engineering and rehabilitation medicine, and trying to find ways that technology can support the gaps in the rehabilitation structure. So what have caused those gaps? So, I mean, we're having an aging population. Some of the stats say by 2050, about maybe a third of our population will be over the age of 60. Some places this is already happening. Some places it's kind of, we're getting there. So imagine, the fact that we're having really great medicine breakthroughs. So people who would have normally died from an injury are surviving, but now they're surviving with disabilities. So we have more and more people growing old with disability. So in that milieu comes the fact that our scientists are not kind of getting into the medical fields where we're having the ability to manage this population. Therapists are essentially very difficult to find, and not enough people are going into the science of rehabilitation. So therefore now we have this issue now where the numbers of people able to take care of this population that's just growing are dwindling. So this is where my technology in my lab comes into place. So I'm thinking on 3 levels. I mean, the rehabilitation is a huge space. So I've been focused on people that have become disabled as a result of neurological injuries and brain injuries. So for example, a stroke survivor. Somewhere after a certain age, we may end up with a blood vessel injury due to stroke, and so we end up disabled. So I also focus on kids with cerebral palsy. So that's, I call that a stroke for a way to visualize it that occurs between 0 and 2 years old. So both of them result in disabilities as a result of the developing brain, or the brain that now has to deal with reorganization. So my goal is, how can I build a robot or use technology that's smarter than the average technology that you see out there to support understanding how to help people recover. So I got into this because of my grandmother, and my grandmother had a stroke while I was getting a master's degree in robotics. And at the time, I was first confronted with this idea of, whoa, what I'm doing in robotics cannot help my grandmother. And at the time, then I started exploring the meld between rehabilitation and robotics, and how can this discipline be leveraged to support people with disability, getting them to be able to use their arms again, getting them to be able to use their legs again, and then the science behind it. How can we use this system or these tools to study what's happening after disability? So that's kind of the work that we do.
So that's really fascinating. And I'm really interested in all of these different approaches to rehabilitation, because as we're learning that the brain is always changing, it's flexible, it's plastic, looking at the toolbox of techniques that we have to really encourage that, one of the interesting areas I've been looking at for an exhibit that we're working on is looking at music for rehabilitation. And in a way, they seem these two opposites in one hand. So here, you're really looking at the machine in the role of the therapy, whereas in the music, it's a lot about the personal contact with a musician and that the way that music moves us as humans. So this is a little bit abstract, but that idea of communication and motivation in rehabilitation. I was wondering, how do robots maybe change that or influence it, or maybe encourage just a different dynamic altogether?
So that's good. So one of the things we struggle with, and so for example, one of the projects that we have in the lab is to try and, the future is maybe we'll get a humanoid in the someone's home or maybe in the hospital, and these are robots that might look like humans. But we don't necessarily want to replace someone. We want to build smarter assistants, kind of how you would use a treadmill as a tool. We want you to, or a person or a clinician or a therapist, to think of the robot as a smarter tool that they can use within their practice. But just like in a tool where you then offer someone 20 minutes on the treadmill to keep walking, you want them to spend 20 minutes maybe with the robot. But then how does the robot mediate that communication, maintain motivation? That's still a problem. So in fact, many of the ways that we try to think about how to build that type of dynamic in the robot is by studying human-human interaction. So one of the projects in the lab is we bring in patients and therapists together and observe using our video-based technology, using kind of instrumenting the therapist and the patient, and we kind of watch using kind of our sensors to understand how they interact. That gives it the human-human touch. And then we look at videos and we understand emotion, what are they saying, how they're cueing each other. And what we're trying to do is understand how that motivation and engagement occurs between human and human, and then say, can we endow the robot with some level of that capability? And we know that I don't believe that we're gonna ever get a robot that fully fools us into thinking that's human. However, I think the better the tool is, the better the clinician might be able to rely on the tool. So in trying to figure that out, we really study the science of that interaction and then map it using our engineering tools onto the robot.
Right. So you told us a little bit about how you were inspired to work in this space. How did you adapt to this merging of a mechanical engineering background and going into the physiology and medicine of the human body?
So I can't deny mentors help. So when I began, as I mentioned, I was in my master's program, and actually my focus has been on space, trying to figure out robots in space. That was a big deal, how to build a hand that would help space station. But I wasn't that engaged or very passionate about that. And one of a colleague, actually, a fellow grad student, started very excitedly talking about this robot he was building for a wheelchair, and that he was gonna, really think that this robot was gonna help people with spinal cord injury, and it was gonna replace the fact that they couldn't use their arm. And so all of a sudden that was like ding, ding, ding. And at the same time, I was confronting how disability changes a person's life. When my grandmother had a stroke, she was 86 years old, so vibrant, and just this wonderfully dynamic woman running here and there. And she was a matriarch, someone I looked up to. And then she had a stroke, and the stroke took her from being able to walk by herself to being wheelchair bound. She couldn't use her arms. She was a designer of wedding dresses. So all of a sudden she couldn't design. And I was confronted with just, wow, how you can go from one day being active to the next day being disabled. So then here where I was confronted with this new burgeoning field where they're starting to use robots within close proximity to people with disability, and having my own issue that I would like to work on. And so those two together actually became my inspiration. And then I discovered, after researching, that this field of rehabilitation robots was just becoming, actually, I would argue that Boston and Delaware, at University of Delaware, AI DuPont, was where one of the conferences that began to pool around this area. They were pioneers in this field, and I luckily had wonderful mentors who said, go, if you find a passion and you find a way to put what you're currently doing with something of the future, go. And it was a new enough field where there's enough innovation and a lot of unknowns in this area. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. And then I switched to Stanford, where there was a lab that was focused in this area, and so that's how it came about.
I love your story of finding a problem that you want to solve that's very personal and relevant to you, and then figuring out how to get there. I think that's an inspiration that I think we all seek. So it's great to hear how you've taken that journey.
Yeah, definitely. So, and one of the things I wanted to say was that core problem still haunts me today, because I literally see my grandmother in every person that comes into my lab that I want to help in that way. And then my passion for translating our technology to the developing world comes from that space too, in that wanting to make sure that the technology is accessible to every person everywhere, no matter where they live in the world, comes from that same passion as well.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that when we have our conversation later, in that I think that personal passion plays such a key role in sustainability. Yeah. That you don't want to burn out. It's that drive from inside that keeps us going. Yes. Well, thank you, Michelle, for sharing those thoughts with us.
You're welcome.
So I'd like to give Michelle a hand. Thank you.
All right, next on the hot seat.
Yep, come on up. So Kevin, I'll go a little vague, not pin you down to a specific year, but your research is in the idea of technology and how technology is changing what we do and the risks and the benefits. But you were actually graduating from college right around the same time that the World Wide Web first went live. So how did you realize that this brave new world was where you wanted to go?
Good. So I was a little curious why I got asked to be on this panel, other than that I figured they needed a token white guy to be part of it. But that gives me some context. And as an aside, this is awesome to not have everyone look like me on this panel. And if any of you ever organize an event or sit on a panel and it's not diverse, think about saying something and doing something, because that's the only way that's going to change. So thanks to the organizers for that. To your question, who wouldn't want to be part of the most extraordinary technological change the world has ever seen?
But did you know that then?
Of course. No, we all knew the internet was going to change, but we didn't know how.
All right, tell me the lottery numbers too.
No, it's the crazy thing about the internet when I got involved in it was it had been around for a long time. I mean, the internet as we know it goes back to the late 1960s, and all through the 70s and 80s, there was this network and set of networks and online services and so forth. So it felt like it had been around for a long time, but actually as a mass commercial phenomenon, it was brand new, and it was small. And so the opportunity for me, I mean, it was really more even beyond when I was in college, but then I went to law school and I was trying to figure out what to do out of law school in 1994, which was the year that the Mosaic and Netscape browser was first released. There were not that many people who were in this space. And I think we all had an inkling about just how incredibly significant it was going to be. And so I went and got a job at the Federal Communications Commission as the internet policy guy. And I was 24 years old. I didn't know anything about anything. But it was the internet. No one did. So I had as much expertise as anyone. And so we would have these meetings. I was part of the team in the Clinton administration that developed the what's called the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce. It was the U.S. policy on internet and electronic commerce, which then became very influential around the world. And we would have these meetings where they would say, okay, let's just find everyone in the US government who knows anything about like internet privacy. And there would be like 10 or 12 of us in this conference room in the executive office building. And then like a month later, they'd be like, okay, now we need to have a meeting with everyone who knows anything about intellectual property online. Come to the meeting, same 10 people, all right? That was all there was. And for me, that's exciting because it's a space of such possibility. So, I mean, no, of course, no one knew what was going to happen. There were all kinds of people, as today, making these kind of grand pronouncements or predictions and so forth. But I think if you were in the space and close to it, it was hard not to see that something that could connect literally everyone on the planet potentially into this network and keep evolving was going to be something just unbelievably important.
So one of the aspects of technology in the classroom that we're hearing a lot about, especially in the museum field, is the role of games. And this is something that you've thought a lot about. From your perspective, can you tell us a little bit about what you see as kind of the core principles of game thinking, and especially as a scientist, how do they leverage how the processes by which our brains work?
Sure. So as you heard, I'm a professor, so I have a really, really awesome job because my job is to be smart. I mean, I have to teach and research and so forth, but basically the idea is be an expert on something and advance human knowledge. And so part of what I do, I study technology and regulation and so forth, but part of what I do is try to find important emerging trends in development. Something like what you talked about, the way the World Wide Web was 20-odd years ago. Not that big, but similarly with tremendous potential. And so one thing I've been following for many years is games. And partly just as a player, but partly just being overwhelmed by the incredible richness and sophistication of the games, the social structures built around them, the virtual goods systems and everything. And so I got really fascinated by these questions about what it is that makes games engaging. I mean, why is it that hundreds of millions of people play things like Candy Crush and Clash of Clans and Pokemon Go? What is it that pulls people in and keeps them playing? And it turns out that game designers think about this a lot. And it turns out that even though most of the game designers had no idea of this, they're exactly the same questions that psychologists ask. What is it that motivates people? The short version is that psychologists, what's called self-determination theory, talk about three elements of what they call intrinsic motivation. So what is something you would do for its own sake, not because you're getting paid or not because of some tangible reward, but intrinsically. And they say, and all the psychological research points to three factors, which are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So competence is mastery. It's overcoming a challenge. It's getting over a difficulty, figuring out the pattern. That's what games are all about. They're all about interesting challenges and puzzles that you have to solve, not necessarily just puzzles that look puzzle-like. It might be how you figure out how to defeat this enemy in a game, but it's all about overcoming those challenges. Autonomy is about you being in charge. It's about you control your destiny. Well, so games are all about, look, the fate of the universe hangs on you, all right? You're the one in charge. The game is always about you. The game's not about someone else, it's about you. And relatedness is about being part of something bigger than yourself. So part of that is a social dimension, and games are tremendously social. There's this misnomer that video games are all just kind of people sitting alone in their room. But so many games themselves are social. Even when the games are single player, people connect with each other and talk to each other and sit in the room with each other and so forth. So there's this tremendous social dimension and this tremendous dimension more broadly of being in a larger world. There's lots of games that connect with people's sense of purpose and their sense of being part of something greater. So it turns out that all of those things, which again, psychologists develop without thinking about games at all, map perfectly onto games in general, in particular digital games, video games. So being a business school professor, I think a lot, and I've been writing and studying this question about how we motivate people in business using techniques from games. Not necessarily games themselves, but how can you make work experiences and other things feel a little bit more game-like? And that applies in lots of different contexts. As you said, it's big in education as well. There's probably more gamification going on in education even than in the business world.
So, I mean, that's certainly a trend that we're all seeing. You are in the business of predicting some of these trends. What else? What are the other big things that we should be thinking about that are coming up in the next 10 years?
Oh, well, so a couple things about that. One is there's something called Amara's Law, which is named after a famous Silicon Valley futurist. And what he said is that we always overestimate the importance of technologies in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. So I can tell you with great confidence what's going to be big sometime in the next 30 or 40 years, but that's not terribly useful. So blockchain, all right? Blockchain is going to change the world. It's not going to change the world tomorrow. If you're in sort of international payments and trade finance, it might change the world in the next 3 or 4 years or 5 years, but it's not going to change everything overnight. So that's one piece of it. If you have to ask, why are we asking that question? If you're asking, what is a set of technological trends that will affect what I'm doing now over a relatively short time horizon, it's all the stuff that's already there. I mean, you already heard about autonomous cars and robotics, so many things we already know about, virtual reality and augmented reality, all these things that you hear a lot about, those are going to be big. The kind of Uber trend, the kind of meta trend that I like to talk about is what I call the Internet of the World. And what that means is that increasingly there's no distinction between the online world and the offline world. So just a couple examples. You think about Uber, I'm sorry about the cough, which won't go away. Uber is great because it's the perfect example of everything that's amazing and great about technology, and it's also the perfect example about everything that's bad and scary and evil about technology. So I love to use it as an example, but when you think about Uber, sure, it's about transportation and so forth, but think about what's happening. You're taking out your digital device, your network-connected smartphone, and looking at a virtual map and pushing a button, and a car arrives. And the car is a physical object. Sitting in the car is a physical driver who's holding a phone. And the car and the driver are an extension of the network. It's as though they're basically being remote controlled by the network. And so it's something entirely in the physical world, and yet it's also something that is basically entirely shaped by algorithms, by digital mapping, by the network connectivity. And so I think that's kind of a harbinger of where we're going, where we just have this desire to naturally sort of draw lines between online and offline and talk about, they're digital natives and digital that. I think increasingly we're in a world where anyone who tries to make that distinction is going down the wrong path. That everything we're doing is going to be both online and offline, and the challenges are figuring out how to rationalize all the real world concerns we have, given that they're going to be increasingly dominated by these digital systems, connectivity, and increasingly big data, analytics, and algorithms.
So I think that's a great place to pause right here, because I think you've given us a view of the future, and we can start thinking about how do we adopt some of these new ideas into what we're doing, and how do we start to sort through what's worth keeping, what isn't working, where do we go back to ideas from the past, how do we bring all of these ideas to sustain the best ones, and also how do we make sure that we give access to those innovations to sustain in both space and time. So I think with that, I'd like to give Kevin a hand first. And then I'd like to ask Michelle and Christine to come back up. While we're talking, please continue to submit questions. I think there are some students who are collecting note cards in the audience as well. You can tweet your questions to #EduCon. And so we'll have a little bit of conversation first, and then we'll switch over to include your questions as part of that discussion. So, I know that the theme of the night is sustainability, but I wanted to tackle the idea of innovations a little bit first, to think about how ideas switch, how they make that shift from these new innovations to then becoming ideas that we want to sustain. And so I encourage all our panelists to jump into conversation with each other. So hopefully we can have some rich discussions about how those themes intersect across these different sectors that our guests represent. But I wanted to start out with a little bit of a bigger question about how we adapt to this kind of climate, where there's more technology coming, some of the challenges that Kevin mentioned, where we sometimes forget to go back to the past. Ultimately, we don't really have a good sense of what we can predict. So how do we prepare ourselves, and what do you wish you had known when you were starting out about how to evolve in this kind of a world?
I can talk from our perspective, being kind of in the area where we are innovating in science and we are trying to develop technology to push the boundary, but at the same time, we're trying to solve real world problems. So we want to innovate something new, but then we want to transition to something that we can then extend into a problem that can then be used to duplicate and solve, a real issue. So I would say that one of the things that we realize is it's so critical to become someone who's always learning and always reading, because the minute I think that I know is the minute that something, comes out that's like, whoa, wait, I didn't even think about that, or a new sensor comes out that transforms kind of the old way of doing some type of key part of the innovation that we had. So now my team might scramble to incorporate that new sensor or that new battery or that new way of connectivity. So now the robot is even much smarter or much smaller or much more wearable. So it's kind of always, for us, it's staying on top and kind of even reading about things in parallel fields to the fields that we care about that might influence us in the future. So our innovation is definitely dependent on everyone else's innovation. and then trying to stay ahead enough to continue to, provide interesting solutions to the problem, but always tweaking it, kind of. So I don't know if I know the answer to how to translate it to being sustainable, because for us, we're always kind of tweaking the solution.
I would echo some of that just in terms of how we are addressing climate change. We know what science is telling us is likely to happen in Philadelphia, which is a warmer and wetter climate. But it is cyclical. You can't just decide, okay, well, now we know what it's going to be, and that's it. We sort of have this great chart that I don't have slides, but I could show you that sort of starts with, what is science telling us? How do we downscale that to Philadelphia? What does that mean for our infrastructure and our assets and our communities? What do we need to do to protect those vulnerable assets? Let's start doing those things. Then let's start measuring those things and seeing if we're making the impact that we intended to make. And then by the time we've started doing that, new data has come out, because science data is constantly being updated with new models and new data from 5 years ago. So by the time we kind of get around the circle again, we have to update everything else and kind of continue. So just like learning is a continual process, I think the act of sort of implementation is also cyclical. You're never done. There's always more to learn, more to revisit, make sure that you're adapting to the newest information.
Yeah, those are really great points. I guess what I would add is that there are two different skill sets, and they're not necessarily in the same person or the same organization. So one is being flexible and open innovation, which, Michelle's absolutely right. You have to get out of your comfort zone. So that's how I got interested in video games. That got me interested in psychology. I have spent a lot of time actually studying education, because there's way more innovation happening in the education world, even then generally in the business world, just people don't realize it, and part of it is it's often kind of small and unconnected. So that's what it takes to constantly be innovative and open innovation. It's not the same thing it necessarily takes to scale it. So again, I teach at the Wharton School. We churn out 800 MBAs a year, and we train them very well, and they're really bright students who go out into the world. They get hired a lot increasingly by Silicon Valley companies, by innovative companies, because they say, you know what, engineer, we got tons and tons of people who say, okay, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to change everything, I want to be the innovator. But okay, if you're Google, you're not looking for a bunch of new innovations all the time. You're looking for things that can scale. Google made $26 billion in the last quarter. So billion-dollar ideas are not that interesting to Google. They want $10 and $100 billion ideas, and they need a skill set of people who can manage things in structures to keep the innovation viable as things grow. And that often is a different set of talent and a different set of people. And you can have both in an organization, and sometimes you have people who have both attributes. But I think we tend to assume that you sort of don't belong in the innovation space if you're good at structuring and organizing and managing.
You know, I think that's.
I hope I didn't shame you into not drinking the bottled water.
Oh, no.
If you have a cough, you should have some water. Sorry.
So Kevin, I'm really glad you brought up that last point, because I think, you know, that idea of different skill sets is something that we hear a lot about in education, especially with some of the recent research into the role of non-cognitive skills in education and achievement. And so I think that's actually a really important point to think about as, you know, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but as questions are coming in. But some of the questions I think are very relevant to what we're talking about right now is this idea of, you know, how do you sustain that spark of curiosity? And a lot of that, you know, is how you integrate those different kinds of skills. Can you talk a little bit about how you maintain, you know, that willingness to change and that excitement about continuing to look for new ideas?
Oh, that's hard. I mean, it comes out of the individual.
Right.
I mean, people have to want to find new things. And some people just naturally have that orientation. But I think organizations and institutions can facilitate that. But you need to find things that are challenging for people. You need to not just assume, okay, this person does this, and we're going to stick them in a room to do that for the next 40 years or whatever amount of time, or the next year if it's in a school situation. So it's really sort of an orientation and a willingness. I mean, the piece I take from the video game work about that is game designers think a lot about what they call the player journey. So if the game is just sort of do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, people get bored, all right? And so that's okay, like, oh, gee, look, I blew up this thing and I got this badge and I got these points and the trophy, woohoo. It's interesting for a while, but eventually it gets dull. But if you feel like you're on a trajectory, you're starting off somewhere and there's a pathway up to mastery, and the game changes as you play it, then you can stay engaged. And that doesn't necessarily mean the game is a massive, realistic 3D environment. It just means the experience evolves as you play it. And so I think if you have that orientation, thinking about how even if you're doing at some broad level the same thing, the experience people are having is different, and people have a sense that they're building to something, then I think that's what keeps them engaged.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's kind of that same cycle that you're talking about. First, for me, I have PhD students on me, and I encourage them to connect to something that they're passionate about. That's what helps to sustain me. And I have a big picture goal, a big vision of what I'd like to do, bring technology to the world. So, of course, that's going to be like one set of time, one city at a time. So you may have this big vision of how your passion is, what you'd like to accomplish on the big level, but then kind of how do I get to work every day and process through this. And I think the key thing is knowing that, okay, I need to get to this trajectory out here or the end goal out there, and what's my path to that process. And I kind of encourage students to think about, like, well, what's the problem? What's the next problem to solve? So you've gotten a little bit of idea, but now the science have changed a little. How do you then adjust your hypothesis, write up that paper, and then maybe develop the next tool, investigate the next thing. So I think it's this always reevaluating. Okay, am I still in the line to where I'm trying to get? And how does the new data that just came in, how does that allow me, or how should I react so that I'm still focused on my mission, but I'm also not stagnant and not changing with the times. So it is a game and a dance, but I think if it's connected to something organic, then I believe that you stay engaged.
I think in the world of government, one of the best things that we have are term limits. Although we may have some issues with that at the moment, our feelings around that. But it basically forces new leadership, and new leadership means new approaches to things. Even if it's the same party or people with similar policies, everyone is going to have a different approach to the way they do work. And I think that's really helpful in getting people out of ruts of doing the same thing all the time. The interesting thing is, like, being part of a new mayoral administration, the mayor's new and a lot of the commissioners and sort of his administration are new, but the civil servants, the sort of big bureaucracy remains the same. And how do you get those folks to want to shift? Especially in Philly, we have a lot of civil servants who start at the city when they're 22 and they retire when they're 65, and they put all that time in. And so how do you motivate folks to do something different? And I think the best way is really through success. The success breeds more success, and people will see a different way of doing things and want to do it. If it's easier for them, more efficient for them, saves their department money, they can use on other things. But it's that first step to getting a new approach to show the success. That's the hardest one. But usually, once people see someone else doing something and thriving, they'll want to jump on it too. So having leadership that drives that and encourages that is really important.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, it's a really good point. People don't, the other side of that structure of government, where you've got new people coming in, often political people, and the civil servants underneath there, is you've got an institutional memory. Because the other danger is you always get new people coming in and say, we're going to change everything. And we know what we're doing, and they don't know anything about the institution, and they don't know how to get anything done. And so you're absolutely right that it's, there's a challenge with people who just are in their lane and don't move at all. But it's also incredibly valuable, I think, to have people who actually know how things work and how to get things done, and the crazy things that didn't work the last time they were tried 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. So you need, I think, that balance.
Yeah. And I wanted to harken on something that I think, because I'm still the director of the lab and kind of the big vision, but one of the things that I realized that helps to innovate in the lab is bringing in new talent and new students and collaborators. And kind of, I may go somewhere and I happen to sit by a neurologist and I'm like talking about their problem, and then I'm like, oh wait, what we do, and then they talk about what they're doing, and then all of a sudden there might be some interesting kinetic reaction going on that says, hey, maybe my solution could help you, and all of a sudden then that changes into a kind of a new direction, new problem, new way to think. So I think keeping that energy of new ideas or that friction through collaboration, through getting new students, sharing students, I think those are ways to also keep the spark going and the excitement, so that you see how your expertise could morph and change and apply to different areas.
I think that's a really great point, because certainly, here at the Franklin Institute, so much of what we do is based in partnerships. And when you think about sustainability, we can come up with new ideas, but we certainly don't have the capacity to keep doing everything that we do. And so, we're always reaching out to partners. I mean, Chris can tell you how often we come knocking on SLA's door. So I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about, what other kinds of partnerships have helped you sustain initiatives that you've started.
Well, I come from the advocacy community. I spent about 10 years working for different environmental policy and advocacy communities and organizations, and I like to think that I'm still an advocate, just inside city government now. But that background really encourages me to continue to work with the advocacy community in a lot of ways. A lot of times I can't get policies I want enacted unless voters are out there telling their legislators that that's what they want. So, hint, hint. I think, I think a lot of people inside city government see advocates as scary, like they're yelling at us, they want us to do stuff, we don't know what to do with it. And I see it as an asset, that if you are passionate about your work and you want to advance it, those are people who are on your side. They're your choir that are going to help you get what you want to get done. So. And then, of course, if they're smart policy folks, then they are also able to do some of the work for you in terms of like, well, did you know California has been doing this? And, this city over here has done that. And have you guys tried this approach? And they're bringing us good ideas and bringing us research that's helpful. So I think those are some of the strongest partners that we have in the city that I rely on every day, really.
I would say collaborators come from kind of all sectors, and depends on really what you're trying to accomplish. In my area, so if I'm, some biggest collaborators are clinicians themselves, medical clinicians, neurologists, physiatrists, the medical doctors that are kind of, doing this work in rehabilitation medicine. I collaborate a lot with therapists because one of my passion is to try to understand how the tools that we bring to the table make people's job easier. And my goal has always been, we're not about trying to build robots that replace jobs, but that are tools that people can use in smarter ways. So I stress that, and I look to collaborate with experts in this area. At the end of the day, I'm an engineer, but I spent a lot of time in the rehab field. So sometimes engineers might think I'm rehab, but I'm like, no, I'm one of you. But they're like, no, not anymore. And the rehab folks are like, you're an engineer. What do you know? I'm like, wait, where am I anyway? So sometimes there's a little bit of danger in that. But kind of finding, being educated. Now I'm one of our, Penn is on this really big thing about taking innovation in the laboratories and trying to push that into commercialization space. So I've been kind of trying to educate myself and how do I find collaborators that understand this area that Kevin talked about, this scalability issue, and taking something that I have a one-off prototype in the lab, and how do I make that scalable? It's not a skill set that I have. So I've been talking a lot to people who've done it in different ways in engineering to understand, well, how do you do that? How do you take something out of your lab and get it into the marketplace? And so I would say the collaborators really depend on kind of where I want to go with it. So I have many, and pretty much even collaborating with the government to get funding to be able to do what you want to do. So takes all shapes.
So it sounds like both of you are thinking about when you're looking at partnerships, that who is complementary for the work that you want to do, and yet how can that shared work lead to mutual success?
Yeah.
And I think when you're thinking about that, looking at the resources, and this is where the conversations between all of you are so critical, is to find out who can help you in what ways, and then how can you both emerge stronger from that.
Yeah.
The flip side, though, is that that goes back to Christina's topic that you mentioned of like one of the best motivators is success, but not everything is successful. Evaluating new innovations, thinking about what is worth sustaining, what is not worth sustaining. I think that's a difficult question as well. So I guess I have kind of two parts. Is that first, how do you measure success? What ideas deserve to be sustained? So let's tackle that first, and then I'll get to my second part.
So I don't think there's one right answer for that. I mean, it's actually a skill to understand what success is for your organization or your goal. And this is something that, again, in my work on gamification, people tend to think, okay, if I get people to play the game, that's great. And you say, well, okay, you're doing this not to sell games. You're doing this, say, because you want to improve your HR function, or you want to get more customers for your business, or you want to get students to succeed in this learning objective. That's your success metric. And the game is a means to the end. But I find that people in organizations especially often haven't stopped to really think and look around and say, okay, what is success for us? Or they've just sort of inherited some kind of surface level of success. And sometimes there are things that you're given that you have to meet certain formal objectives. But there's an art to defining success, and I think there's a value in stopping and collaboratively, if you can, figuring out what does success mean for us, because until you do that, then you don't really know what success and failure are. And then, it's a skill set and a culture around experimenting, being willing to fail, because you can't really succeed unless you have some tolerance for failure and some respect for failures that are learning experiences, and not the failures that are just things you never should have tried to begin with, but being able to learn and try new things. And so, when I study technology companies, the ones that are the most innovative over a sustained period of time are the ones that sort of built that organization and culture and hired in people who are constantly willing to try new things and are not afraid to fail.
I think one of the jokes we often make sometimes in government is in Philly is that oftentimes we're a little behind the curve on national trends, and one of the good things about being behind is that you can learn from everyone else's mistakes. So we don't have to make them here first. So bike share, we're pretty late adopting a public bike share system, so we were able to learn from all these other international cities and cities in the US and came out with a program that really prioritized equity and access in our communities and affordability, and so our program is super successful in a variety of ways that were important to us. Whether if we'd come out earlier, we might have Seattle just shut down their bike share program actually, and they were one of the first to start it, and they didn't really have it set up properly. So there's something to be said about learning from others and letting them make the mistakes. But that being said, I mean, it's really hard for government to make mistakes. I think we get criticized so easily. Your tax dollars at work, you don't want to see that go into failure. So when but we love talking about pilots, right? Like we never commit to anything until we've piloted it a bunch of times. And one of the important things that I've always emphasized is if we're going to pilot it, we need to know what we're trying to get out of it. So what are the sort of research questions that we can all, as we said, collaboratively decide if it's 5-6 different departments that have an interest in this thing. What do you want to learn out of it? What do you want to see, so that we can capture that data, so we can ask those questions, we can do real evaluation to decide at the end of whatever period that this has been successful, or it's we don't know, but at least it's telling us that there's more we can learn here. And so I think starting pilots with the idea of we want to learn something specific and this is what it is the right approach versus just let's throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what happens.
Yeah. They have a saying now, kind of in engineering, of this like rapid prototyping, rapid failing, rapid cycle. So now usually, so in the same vein of piloting, it's kind of testing the waters to see if your product will actually help in the way you think. Will people find it usable? Those are usually the questions I'm asking. Would they accept it? Is it potentially something that we can kind of use within the structure of healthcare, those types of things, but not kind of waiting 2 years down the line to find that answer, but trying to construct mini experiments that can tell you quickly whether you're on the right track or not. Maybe we don't build a $1,000 product, but we build a $10 version and test, we test look like, feel like, work like. I teach a class called Rehabilitation Engineering Design, and in the class I encourage students to not necessarily try to build the entire product, but to think about, well, what does it look like? And then maybe get some feedback on that. And build maybe, what does it feel like, so that you can go out there to patients and maybe they touch it, they feel it, and then they go, well, we don't like that. And so you don't spend all this money and time building the end product, and then you could have probably gotten some answers on some mini parts of the experiment prior to the end. So this idea that it's okay to fail, but if you're failing rapidly, it actually leads to success, because then you don't waste time and money. And I've learned the hard way, because I think as a scientist, I find myself not liking to let go of babies. I think of every product as a baby, and I'm like, no, I don't want to kill it. but kind of figuring out when to let go, and then in this new world of rapid prototyping, it's kind of saying you don't get attached too quickly until you know it's going to be successful.
Well, I think there's kind of a broader lesson to learn in all of those, is that creating a culture and an environment where failure is okay, but also providing the resources for that rapid iteration, and both in terms of developing technical skills as well as that mindset that failure is important. And I think that's a challenge for education, because the stakes in education have been raised so high that often we don't feel like there's that room for failure. And what does that mean long term for the way that our students are learning? I had an interesting conversation that I just was reminded of, with this idea that for high school students, that maybe we're taking away their opportunities to fail to the point where maybe we need virtual reality. That we need
Well,
a
that's why they play
virtual,
games,
right?
because
We
games,
need a
everyone's
virtual
going to fail
space to
sometime.
fail, right?
So that's what's great about them.
So yeah, who knows? But how do we as educators, foster that mindset? And as Ella was mentioning, how important this problem-based learning model is, and I think that really gets to that. That being said, even when you find something that's successful, getting back to this idea of how do you sustain it in space and time, there are lots of challenges. And so what are some of the challenges and the scope of challenge that we should be thinking about?
In terms of growing, sustaining things?
Yeah, so whether it's keeping things sustained over time or trying to build broader access to it. What are the different factors that we have to think about, and are there examples where maybe you failed in
Well, I mean, part of it is things change over time. And the context changes and the people changes and the assumptions may change. So something that may work at one time will not necessarily work at another time. Another factor is, again, sometimes things grow. And something that works in a small community that's close-knit and knows each other doesn't necessarily have the structure to work in a much larger, more open community. So those are just, always challenges that you have. I mean, I've failed plenty of times, and I've probably failed the most in education because it turns out that I'm a professor, and that also does involve being a teacher. And to me, that's been far harder than succeeding in government or in organization or in business, partly for the reasons that you described, and partly because it's really so dynamic. I mean, you're getting a new group of students every year, and they're all different, and the world that they're experiencing is different. I mean, I teach about technology, and just, I remember, there was the period where, I was on Facebook, because you could only get on Facebook with an EDU account, and none of my students had heard about Facebook. Then there was a period where all of them were on Facebook, and then I was on Twitter. None of them heard about Twitter, and then, and now they're, way past me. But year to year, this would change, and I would give these examples and get blank stares. I was like, well, last year the students knew what that meant, and they're like, oh, you're old, you don't get it, things change. And so, I think that's what's great about education, but I think that's just an inherent challenge, and even if you're teaching exactly the same thing, the world that you're inhabiting is constantly changing.
I would say sort of our budget is a constant, obviously, challenge. But I look at it sort of similar to the challenge of maintenance. We love groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings and having new shiny things, and we really don't like to put money into maintenance. It's just not as shiny and sexy, and that sort of mentality comes throughout. I think a lot of work that people are doing, and is a challenge in terms of sustaining things. I think one of the hardest things for government to invest in is sort of the support services, so our HR systems, our IT systems, because they're not the flashy things that get people elected or get their department accolades or good press. They're just the fundamentals of working. But our IT system in the city is super outdated. We just got off of Lotus Notes 2 years ago. I'm not kidding.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not kidding. In 2013, we got off of Lotus Notes. So, it's really hard to make the justification that we have to spend money to maintain a sort of modicum of, functionability as a city government. That requires investments of money, and that's a constant problem. And in politics in general, it's the definition is the allocation of limited resources. And so how do you sort of prioritize when we have tons of issues and problems and things we want to do? So we just all need to make a zillion more dollars and have a more tax base to support our city government so we can do these things.
Yeah, well, at every level, if I could just say, at the federal level, one of the best things that the Obama administration did, which most people have never heard about, is something called the U.S. Digital Service and some affiliated programs. So there was a big scandal when the healthcare.gov website crashed when it was first launched. The much bigger story is how it got fixed. And how what happened out of that process, because as Christine said, no one cares about the IT systems, and yet that's essential to the functioning of the program. The administration built a program to bring in great technologists, to go to Silicon Valley and say, give us a year or two of your life to change the world. to do things that affect millions and millions of people, and have built this army of technologists that go into the government agencies and work to make the systems work better and to get to modern standards and use open source and so forth. And it's been utterly transformative of government. And it seems like it's one of the things that the Trump people have said, at least initially, they're going to continue, which would be fabulous. But yeah, that's the stuff that no one really hears about on the outside because it's not sexy, it's not the big ribbon cuttings. But if you want to actually implement something that's going to work and going to keep working, then you're absolutely right. You've got to get the plumbing to work too.
So you both addressed kind of this idea that we have our own work, but it's in the context of a system that we may or may not have control over. And there's an audience question here that I think is really relevant, is that what advice do you have for an innovator, in this case an innovative educator, but when you're constrained by a system that is top-down and reactive?
You're out of luck, kidding. I'm sorry. It's a tough one. I think even within the confines of a particular system, you can still innovate on a kind of a classroom scale or a mini scale within your lab, within the place that you have control. And then one of the things that I find that I try to do is kind of create a movement, a collaborative movement. So the idea that I innovated in the lab, hey, are you willing to try it? I export it to a colleague who's excited about it, and then have them try it in their lab. And then if it does work, then kind of try to get like this groundswell working where now this concept becomes something that I try to write about. As a scholar, if you get it written about, is it a newsletter, is it a journal article, someone else is reading that and going, hey, I'd like to try that in my classroom, my lab, my hospital, and then all of a sudden it becomes this kind of groundswell to get things going, and then it trickles up, and then your boss reads the newsletter and go, whoa, I didn't know you were involved. We'd like to do this in blah, so sometimes it is kind of getting the word out that way. I've done that where my chair may go, oh, I just read about your work in such, I'm 2 doors down from you and you don't. But anyway, sometimes reading about it because someone else has gotten a wind of your innovation could be a way to kind of get your top people moving on the idea.
So another question is, again, trying to get into this, some of the practical outcomes of sustainability is, how do we get to a place where it's supported economically? How can sustaining innovations lead to sustainable income?
It's also a good, tough one.
These are really great questions.
I mean, the best example I have locally is, I mentioned earlier, the city's green infrastructure program that the water department's running. And essentially it's a problem of, again, having an old sewer system that can't keep up with all of the strain that we put on it, and coming up with this new concept of, let's keep water out of the system rather than having to spend money to build a bigger system or build tanks to hold sewage during a storm so that it can then later pass through and be processed. Let's try to keep water out by using soil, essentially, which will hold on to water during the storm and retain it, and then sort of slowly release it later. The city deciding to make that commitment, we're the first city in the country to propose and get approval from EPA to use green infrastructure as the primary means of controlling the sewage problem. And it's a $2 billion investment. Sounds like a lot, but the alternative, the big, building more tanks and tunnels option was a $10 billion option. So it's much cheaper, and for a city with 25% poverty rate, it was really the only one we could afford, which is part of the reason why EPA let us do it, because we were like, well, it's this or we don't have any money to do anything else. And the result has been that there's now thriving green infrastructure business community of some businesses that didn't even exist 5 years ago before this the city made this commitment and this program kicked off. And people are being, entrepreneurial and innovative and finding new tools, new services, new financing mechanisms that they're taking to the water department or taking to developers who have to abide by water department regulations and finding a market and growing from there. So I see how, sort of the government has led a little bit by example and is now driving an economic opportunity for our city versus, literally putting money underground into tunnels that would have served one purpose and one purpose only. We're now getting, things above ground like trees and parks that add beauty and add air quality benefits and urban heat island benefits and employ people in our own communities. So it's however you can take that and apply it to 10 other topic areas, do that.
And you mentioned something that I think each of your career paths also reflects, is that there's economic opportunity in these emerging fields at the intersection of different disciplines. And that offers new economic possibility as well. And so, how can we encourage our students to, look for those opportunities instead of looking at what's existing right now and trying to predict where that industry might be 50 years from now? Where's the next World Wide Web going to be? How can I combine my interests and my skills to maybe create an economic opportunity for me?
Well, it's more keep your eyes open, and it's think in those terms. It's important to have an orientation towards those economic opportunities, and there's some things that you do just for love, and there's some things you do just because you have to. But it's one thing that's been kind of invigorating for me being in a business school. My degree is in law, and my background is studying technology. There's kind of this notion that a place like Wharton is just about sort of churning out these investment bankers who care about nothing but shareholder value maximization. It's not entirely true, but there is sort of a baseline orientation, even though we're a nonprofit educational institution. There's an orientation towards how is this actually going to be sustaining? How is it going to generate? Well, what are the incentives? Just even the very way that, if I want to teach a new class, the question is, okay, who's going to take the class? We don't want to field a class that no one's going to want to take. And I think that does sort of in a healthy way sometimes push you to say, well, okay, I can't just say, this is really interesting to me. I've got to actually have something I can sell, something that has a response. So I think just in general, that people often don't want to think about things in those terms. But if you look around for opportunities, sometimes they're there, and they're often going to be there at these new intersections. Where again, my story with the internet was, I didn't really know all that much, but very few people did. So it was a great opportunity. And if you find those kind of new spaces where you can very quickly become an expert, and now it's so amazingly possible for people to have blogs and become visible people who are thought leaders on issues, coming out of nowhere, that I think there's a lot more opportunity to do that if that's what you want to do.
I think similar to the not being afraid to fail kind of concept is like that anybody in their career path, whether they're in high school or college or mid-career, is to not be afraid of making a bad mistake picking a job. We're no longer in an environment where people get a job and work at it for 30 years and then retire. I know when I graduated, it was like average of every 7 years people were changing jobs. I'm sure it's even shorter now. And I think there's like the side gig economy more and more now, where folks aren't even having full 40-hour jobs with benefits, but kind of cobbling together a couple of different jobs that they do, and some of those are very entrepreneurial, small business oriented. I gave some remarks last night to my alma mater at Villanova to some graduate students who, of course, are like really freaked out about what they're going to do after graduation. And I didn't realize it until I was talking about my career path with them that I've had 5 jobs since I've graduated in 2001, and 3 of them didn't exist until I asked for them to exist. So, I definitely have that sort of more modern approach to changing jobs. I did about 1.5 years in academia, no offense. It wasn't for me. It was just not for me. It was in 18 months, and I was like, yep, I did that. I need to move on now. So, you make some jumps and you try things out, and if they're not for you, don't be afraid to move on. And I think the more students realize that they don't have one path that's a successful path, that there's many different ways they can go, and they can take meandering paths around and still end up at a successful place, maybe the more relaxed they'll feel about where they need to end up.
What I was going to add to this, and I think these are great advice, I would add one more thing, is to kind of ask wherever there is the intersection or the things that make you go, I always say, pay attention to those things, because that's actually where the interest might lie. I always say when I teach class on like how do you build the next rehab product, or how do you innovate in the area of engineering and rehabilitation and create something new, I say it's where you ask yourself questions and you discover that no one has solved that problem. So where you go, this does not work. And why do we keep using this when it doesn't work? And if someone just says, well, it's because it's the only one that's there, everyone's complaining about X and no one has come up with a good solution for X. Maybe that's an opportunity to innovate. I always say pay attention to the complaints, what irritates you, what makes you go, is there a better way? Because every time you do that, that's actually one of those things that may become the innovation. I tell this story, and it's a kind of anecdote, and I think if everyone here who's female might already appreciate this, where you take the toilet paper off and create, I'm like, why didn't I invent this? We obviously knew this was a problem. When you take and you create a seat, but this is the point where I say, inventing those seat covers for the toilet, every one of us could have probably invented that a long time ago if we had stopped and said, this needs to exist. So I think if wherever we find ourselves creating something that doesn't exist is actually at that intersection of a possible innovation. And I tell my students to pay attention to that, because there may be enough people in the room that want to solve that problem.
So, I think that the theme that emerges there is, if you're thinking about this economic impact, then it is really that to keep looking forward, that, there are changes happening where the money will follow, and that's where the jobs are going to be. So I don't know what that means for education in particular. Maybe it's just the inspirational aspect of it. But another question is kind of the flip side, and Michelle, you started talking about this a little bit, is when do you cut the cord on something? When do you stop sustaining something to be able to open opportunities to accomplish something else?
When the money is ran out.
Sometimes a decision is forced upon you.
Sometimes the decision's forced. So if you can't find the funds to sustain it, that might mean a time to pivot. Another time that you might have to pivot is when you realize that some notions or things that you were doing, maybe it's successful, but the success that you were hoping for hasn't actually been achieved, and you may recalculate that the cost to achieve that success might be a lot more than you can afford to put in terms of time, resources, and money. And you might decide that from a kind of a practical point of view, further investment may not be smart, and it may be time to pivot away from that, or pivot in a new innovation area where maybe there's an opportunity where you can use the resources you had or the money you have, et cetera. So I think you're constantly reevaluating that, and for me it's very tough, because I'm very passionate about a lot of the projects that I'm pursuing, and I want to solve and continue to solve and continue to work on it. But then I got to go, well, if I can't get funding for this through a grant, or pay for a student, or pay for the project to keep going, then I got to make a decision about whether I got to scuttle that project or not. So sometimes it's that practical backbone, and then other times it's obsolescence. The technology is old, and maybe you see that the field is going in a new area, and what you were working on, unfortunately, maybe someone has already solved it, and then you need to pivot and go on to something else.
I'd just say the expression that, don't keep making a mistake just because you've spent so much time making it is a good one to remind yourself that, just because you've started investing your time or your emotions or your money into something doesn't mean you keep throwing good after bad. You have to, I think, be harsh sometimes. And sometimes it is just maybe not the right time. I've had a lot of ideas over the years of things I wanted to do, and it just didn't have the time at the moment, didn't have the right staff to help run it. You can put things on a shelf and come back to them later, and maybe a better time comes and a funder is now interested in this thing that wasn't there before. So we don't always have to burn bridges to the ground. We can kind of say, well, this is still a good idea, just not for this particular moment, or I'm not the right one to carry it forward right now.
So we've talked a lot about science and technology tonight. How do the arts influence the process of innovation, potential partners for sustainability? Again, thinking about these interdisciplinary areas.
I think, you talk about games, and I think about kind of the work that I'm doing is you would never think that games would be involved, but there's a huge area now called enabling games. So in order to get cheaper technology, we often leverage virtual reality or games to get people doing exercise longer. So something I did recently was I employed or kind of sponsored a mini gaming challenge to these gamers and artists who build games, and I asked them, you only have 1 degree of freedom machine, and it has to work in these interesting games that people with cognitive disabilities and people with motor function need to be able to play. And they were super excited. They sponsored this competition and actually built us 2 games that were really interesting that someone that would use our machines would be able to play. So it's this intersection of this gaming, VR type world with medicine. So in that sense, I think you can kind of, find these relationships. I have a colleague who, she does network science work, and so she's looking at how the brain interconnects. And so she had all this big data, and she wanted the artists she asked these artists to imagine how the data comes apart. So I think and in a very creative way, they kind of drew what they thought the relationships of the networks were. And I think of that and I'm like, oh, I would have never thought about that, but that's kind of cool. Of how then the arts informs the engineering and the science, and actually may open up maybe a possibility that you didn't see before. So I definitely think there's ways that music, art, and all these different modalities can come together to kind of push you forward in unique ways.
No, I mean, arts are about creativity, and creativity and innovation are not the same thing, but they're connected at a deep level. And so, yeah, I think and I mean, games are a great example, and not just games in other spaces, but you look at what it takes to design a great video game, and it takes a lot of design and creativity and animation, but it also takes a lot of coding and engineering and structure and level design. And so it's part of what interested me about that space, that it's just an inherent fusion. But I think what Michelle said is true. I mean, everywhere you look, you can find opportunities where the arts sort of inject that, looking into a broader possibility space, which can often be a real sort of Kickstarter for innovation.
And it's especially working in the museum field, where I see arts coming in every day is that it makes us better communicators. Because even for people who don't perceive themselves to be scientists or knowledgeable about technology, the basis of art is something that speaks to all of us. And when you're thinking about sustainability, being able to communicate, being able to make that relevant to people, I think the arts has a lot to do with that. So that's something that I certainly see every day. So this has been a fascinating discussion. The last question that I want to mention that came in from the audience is one that I'm actually going to throw back at you, which is, how do you incorporate sustainability in K-12 education? We all have our strengths, but none of us are K-12 educators. So that is really a question for you to answer over the next couple of days as you're taking advantage of all the conversations that will be going on. Hopefully the conversation that we've had here has jump-started you thinking about that, but we don't have the answers. And that's the challenge for you, is to go to that creative space, think about what it means for you, what it means for your school, and then think about some of these ideas, how they can help you implement that when you get back home. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I hope this is just the start of a great weekend, and I hope you'll join us for the reception this evening. And I'd like to give one final round of applause to Kevin, Christine, and Michelle for really bringing some inspirational ideas tonight. Thanks a lot, and do you want to, sorry, I thought you wanted.
Sorry. Yeah, so we're going to now, just for folks, if you go out to the planetarium.